Alexis, one of the stories that I put to our guests yesterday, and I'll put it to you this morning, it's in the chart library, GTV, which is Donald Trump talking about basically tariffing everything that comes from China. But Mohammed Al-Arian made the point that we're almost facing a Reagan-esque moment in that China physically can't keep up with this level of tariffs, and therefore they will go into negotiation. We are nearer the end of this process than we are at the beginning. There will be substantive discussions because they just can't make up the goods. This is the U.S. imports to China in the blue and U.S. exports to China in the white, as you can see there. They just can't keep up with the game.
Well, I think we're still relatively early in the trade story. I mean, yes, perhaps this year the Chinese economy has softened a little bit. And I think it's interesting when you think about the strategy of the Trump administration, applying tariffs has really always been about pushing China to reduce trade barriers overall, forcing China really to capitulate at some point. Whether we're at that point now or China will continue to push the US further remains to be seen.
I was drawn to a nice line from the former deputy US trade representative to President Obama, who said, if we don't find an exit ramp, this will accelerate like a snowball going down a hill. And that's what's really interesting, is to talk, when you talk about the timing and what is the long tail on this story, how long does it take us to get to the end game? Where is that off-ramp?
I mean, I think it's anybody's guess at this point how much longer this can run for. I think there's broad agreement, though, that raising trade barriers is bad for the economy. We've seen, in past decades, examples where trade barriers were raised and that was quite costly. So I think the end game still is for trade tariffs and barriers overall to be relatively low. But it may take some time because neither side wants to capitulate, really, at the end of the day. China does not want to be bullied.
Alexis, the other thing, and Anna and I have managed to ask this question now in 45, 50 different ways. So let's go at it again. The yuan had its worst quarter since 1994. And Goldman Sachs make a point this morning, and they say the risk is this: there is a risk of a real miscalculation. And to a certain extent, this carries on from Anna's point. And that's the scenario that you've got to run, the real risk of a miscalculation. What would that look like? And is that more likely from the US side than it is from the Chinese side?
Well, I think raising trade barriers is costly on both sides and represents a drag on GDP, depending on how bad this gets, how much further it escalates. At the moment, the size of tariffs has been relatively small, and so the drag on GDP, I think, is relatively small. It actually raises inflation because it obviously increases prices. But the further that this goes, the more likely it becomes that we have, at the extreme, a global recession. But that's some way off from here.
Again,